Thank you, Danny. And let me thank Jean-Michel Glachan for the invitation, for the excellent organization of this conference, this session in particular. Today's sessions are very informative, very useful. I'll provide an overview of climate change policy that then Jos will will focus more on Europe, and then the discussion will try to answer the questions that Danny presented in his introduction. I'm going to, first of all, survey this situation on climate policy. You know that for years there has been a focus on this 2-degree target and the fact that concentrations should be stabilized, concentrations of greenhouse gases should be stabilized at the level that enables to achieve this 2-degree target. And of course, emissions in the meanwhile kept increasing. So where do we stand? The IPCC, this is the fourth assessment report in a few months. The fifth assessment report will be delivered, but the conclusion will not be much different. Says that if we want to be pretty sure, I mean, the likelihood to achieve the 2-degree target to be sufficiently high, then concentration should be stabilized at 450 ppm. Concentrations today are 430. They are increasing about 3 ppm per year. So in a few years, we will achieve the 450. And therefore, the probability of achieving the 2-degree target is likely to be quite low. So all the discussions, the G8 meeting, the G20 meeting, all the discussions in different conference of parties about this target are likely not to be very informative, because climate policy is probably targeted, the future climate policy is probably targeted something more than 2 degrees, with some exception. I mean, we're talking about probability, and I'll mention what can be done to stay on the 2-degree path, of the path achieving the 2-degree target. The situation in particular, if you look at this slide, is such that if we focus mitigation policy on the flow of emissions, so on the amount of emissions produced every year, the probability of achieving the 2-degree target is really low. But if technologies to reduce the stock of emissions were available, so the stock of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions were available, then of course it would be much easier to stay on the 2-degree target, to achieve the 2-degree target, or even other targets, more ambitious targets could be achieved if technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere were available. Just to summarize briefly, we had three options. One is mitigation, reduction of the flow of emission. The second one is what I call enhanced mitigation, the possibility of reducing the stock of emission, which implies that we can even increase emissions, the flow of emission in the short term, overshooting the 2-degree target, and then coming back by reducing the stock of emissions. And the third option is, of course, adaptation. In any case, even in the case in which we achieve the 2-degree target, some climate change are unavoidable. Climate change is occurred for the last 150 years. There are changes that are recorded and more and more important every year, so there is not a discussion about it. The discussion is how to deal with it, how to tackle climate change. And of course, adaptation remains an option, because some changes will occur. Some countries are vulnerable, some regions that will be affected by climate change, and therefore adaptation is a policy to be considered together with the other one. The problem is, what's the optimal balance? How much of it? How much should we focus on reducing the flow, how much on the stock, and how much on adaptation? First option, mitigation, reduction of the flow. Of course, if you want to achieve the 2-degree target, it is a concentration of greenhouse gas emissions equal to 450 ppm, we should be able to reduce immediately and cooperatively greenhouse gas emissions, which means that the most countries, at least G20, the major emitters at the world level, should start reducing emissions immediately and cooperatively. This is obviously not the case. I mean, recent discussions, recent conferences on climate change show a stalemate in negotiations. There is a usual contrast between developing and developed countries, and even though there is progress, even though at the domestic level actions are implemented, we are far from achieving a global or even a partial agreement on emission reductions, which involves the major emitters. Even from a technological viewpoint, the situation is not at its best, because the nuclear option, for example, which would be important to deal with climate change, is unlikely to be available at a large scale in the coming years. The energy mix is changing, but really very slowly if you want to achieve the target. And there is an important increase in energy demand at the world level that, of course, implies more emission. Just a parenthesis, I did appreciate what Professor Ranci said this morning about the energy divide and energy poverty. Let me just say that if 1 billion people has access to basic energy needs, satisfy their own energy need, they would increase total energy demand by only 1%. So this is not a reason. Total emissions by only 1%. It's not a reason to say, okay, if those 1 billion people have access to energy, they will increase emission. This is not true. I mean, the increase in energy demand and emissions come from the top level of energy demand, so the richest countries and the developing countries are becoming richer and richer, in particular the fraction of China and India, which is consuming more and more energy. Just to mention this issue. And this is a diagram that shows what I'm saying. The two green bars, the green lines, are the targets which are consistent, fairly consistent with the 2-degree target. So the path of emissions that are fairly consistent with the 2-degree targets. In yellow, orange, and red, you see the emissions, the path of emissions of India, China, and the other developing countries, take into account the targets they have adopted, the measures they have adopted to reduce their emissions in terms of emission intensity and not in terms of level of emissions. And the white area between the green line and the yellow line gives the residual emissions that OECD countries are allowed to produce if they want to stick to the 2-degree target. And you see that about 235, 240 emissions in OECD countries should go to zero if we want to achieve the 2-degree target, which is obviously unlikely. So again, we should be ready probably to adopt a policy which is less ambitious, maybe more than 2 degrees, but still a policy is necessary. Still a policy is crucial, because otherwise emission will be much higher. Therefore, if you want to focus on mitigation, there are many options that could be adopted. The European Union has its own policy measures. Certainly, we can deliver important emission reductions by a better city management, by better agriculture management, by increasing investment in research and innovation, by improving environmental consciousness in consumption, production, investments, in generally no economic activities. Energy efficiency was mentioned today, is another important option, but more generally pricing carbon. I mean, this is a basic message in all 101 economics textbook. Externality should be priced, and this is an important externality that must be priced. Of course, we need to discuss, or we must discuss about the right price, but certainly markets, in particular the ETS scheme, is able to single out what's the right price for emissions, and pricing carbon is the basic message that should be adopted, whatever the economic situation, whatever the country we are talking about, and whatever the future prospects for emissions and climate change. The second option was enhanced mitigation. It would be nice to be able to reduce the stock of emissions, because that would solve a lot of problems. It would be nice to have geoengineering as a policy option. This would solve a lot of problems. But today, at least as far as we know, there are no such options at a large scale. If you want to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at the large scale with the present technology, I think that we are gonna make an effort which is not reasonable, not credible at all. These are the technology that we know today could deliver large-scale carbon dioxide removal, land use and afforestation, bioenergy with CCS, biomass and biochar, but all of them are not ready, not there to achieve the objective. If we compute the size of land that would be necessary to remove the quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is consistent with the 2-degree target, you see that the size of total arable land that should be devoted to this objective is really too large. Not really a credible measure. So we are left with the other option. We are left with mitigation. The third option is adaptation. Certainly, adaptation is going to be useful. Adaptation is going to be necessary, in particular in developing countries. I mean, we should not forget that climate policy is also an equity dimension. The vulnerable countries are and will be the developing countries. And we want these countries to develop. If we want these countries to achieve basic economic development and basic economic needs, we need to help them through measures that help them to adapt to climate change, not just standard development aid, but development aid targeted to adapt to climate change, which will affect these regions of the world. Costs. Sometimes people argue about costs of all this. There are many estimates. I'm using the one from the International Energy Agency, which provides estimate at about 430 billion per year to achieve the kind of targets that I described before. And of course, this is a figure which can be considered quite high, but not that high. I mean, certainly countries can afford a kind of investment of this size. I had figures also for innovations, for other kind of investments, but I would like to conclude with this slide that gives sort of a synthesis of the message that I would like to deliver to this audience. First of all, EU climate policy contains really a basic number of elements. The minimum number of elements is not too ambitious. It's not too much. It really contains the minimum number of measures that should be implemented and make economic sense, whatever the climate predictions, whatever climate sensitivity, whatever the economic downturn. We are just pricing carbon in Europe. We're just pricing carbon. We're just raising energy efficiency and shifting the long-term energy demand towards renewables. And this is something that all countries should do all over across the world. It's really wise economic policy, nothing else than wise economic policy. Of course, there is more. We need to induce much higher investments if we want to achieve these ambitious targets. But recovery can be an option. The present economic crisis can be an option because investments to help the economy to develop after the crisis can only be green. I mean, again, a smart government can only move into green economic development. There is no other reasonable option. And of course, a lot of investments take place anyway in the energy sector in particular. And there is an issue of diverting this investment or restructuring this investment, redesigning these investments with a small additional cost. This is also an important message. A lot of the huge amount of money which is necessary would be spent anyway. It will spend anyway in the energy sector, will spend anyway in developing countries because they need energy. We need just to divert investment, to create a condition to invest in a different way, in the right infrastructures, in the right ways of using energy in order to control emissions, concentration of greenhouse gases, and then climate change. And of course, research is crucial. And even research on carbon dioxide removal, even research on geoengineering is crucial because we need to be cautious and even develop technologies that may be useful, may not be useful, but certainly we must be ready to use these technologies in the case something goes wrong in terms of policy, in terms of development. But research is underway, more investment are necessary. Again, how much? Easy computation. Now investments in the energy sector is about 0.02% of global GDP. In the 80s, investments in the energy sector, in research in the energy sector, were about 0.008, 4 times the present level. Small amount of money, 4 times. If you go back to the level of the 80s, we would achieve what we need. So again, not strange or bizarre increase in investments. The level of the 80s would be more than enough to achieve the target that we have in mind, that we face, and the challenges that our societies face if they want to deal with climate change in the coming decades. Thank you very much.